We have entered the ad hominem personal attacks phase of the New York City mayoral race. Andrew Cuomo is attacking Zohran Mamdani for living in a rent stabilized apartment unit. Mamdani pays $2,300 a month to live in Astoria, Queens, in a one-bedroom apartment, despite earning $142,000 as a state assemblyman. He says he took the apartment when he was younger and was making far less money. Cuomo is now proposing a law that states that to reserve these coveted rent stabilized units for the most poor New Yorkers, and that anyone with means is no longer eligible for rent stabilized units. Cuomo argues that there's many New Yorkers like Mamdani who are in rent stabilized units when they really shouldn't be. Currently, there's 1 million units, or about 40% of the total rental market that is in New York City that is considered rent stabilized. Cuomo's proposing a rule, he's calling it Zoran's Law, that would allow people to move into rent stabilized units only if they are considered rent burdened or that they're spending 30% of their total income on rent. For example, if an apartment rents for $2,500 a month, that's $30,000 a year. The annual income of that household could not exceed $100,000, right? 30% of 100,000 is $30,000 a year, a month, a year. Incomes and eligibility would be verified by landlords at the time of move-in, and then theoretically, if you made more money, you could still stay in your unit. Currently in New York, there's no single lottery or waiting list for rent stabilized units. It's more based on timing and networking and knowing where to look. So proponents of this Zoran's rule, Zoran's law, would argue that of the 1 million rent stabilized units, about 4 in 10 of the people who live there are considered rent burdened or spending 30% of their incomes on rent, and would hypothetically qualify for the units that they're currently living in, which means about 60% of the people who live in rent stabilized units are not necessarily the rent burden. Meanwhile, however, 40% of those New Yorkers of New Yorkers living in rent market rate units are considered rent burdened. And so the conclusion there would be that the benefits of rent stabilization are not really well targeted, that there's plenty of rent burdened New Yorkers who are not in rent stabilized units, while there's plenty who are not rent burdened who are in. Opponents of this rule would argue that rent stabilized units overwhelmingly help middle class and low income New Yorkers. That according to the Rent Guidance Board, the median household income for a rent stabilized unit holder is about $44,000 a year, while the median income for those in market rate units is more like $67,000 a year. So the data shows that most rent stabilized units are going to poorer and middle class New Yorkers. That wealthy New Yorkers in rent stabilized units is really a small minority. And so therefore a rule like this would not really impact New Yorkers all that much. But what it would do is add a bureaucratic layer to the rent stabilized unit process, that landlords would now need to verify incomes, and we would have to create a new governmental bureaucracy to track incomes, and then you have possible privacy concerns and yet another bureaucratic agency in New York City government. Opponents of this rule would also argue that rent stabilization was never supposed to include rent income limits. What it was supposed to do is only ensure neighborhood stability and a predictable housing baseline rather than a targeted affordability program. Here's my take. Cuomo Zoran's law feels more like a political stunt than an actual policy proposal. Yes, there is a valid argument that if a high earning New Yorker is holding a scarce rent stabilized unit, that feels wrong, especially when uh, so many people are struggling to afford rent as is. But it seems like the data shows that the cases where wealthy New Yorkers are in rent stabilized units, that's a pretty rare phenomenon. And so this won't meaningfully free up rent stabilized units for other New Yorkers. But it would do is add extra red tape, something that New York City government very much does not need. Uh, and it would push landlords into quasi income policing roles, which is something they don't need when we're trying to reduce the red tape for landlords. I also think there's an argument that rent stabilization was really never supposed to be a targeted affordability program. And so I think that has validity as well. In practice, this feels less like a housing reform and more like Cuomo trying to score cheap political points as he's struggling in his campaign and trying to make headlines rather than actually reduce housing costs for New Yorkers. If the goal is truly to reduce housing costs, which I think every politician and every party needs to be focused on, because we are at crisis levels of housing costs in America today. If the goal is that, then the biggest wins are going to come from policies that increase supply, lower operating costs, and target subsidies most efficiently.